Hey guys, tonight we're slipping quietly into the flickering candlelight of a medieval castle's cold stone hallways. You feel the chill creep along your arms, the rough edges of ancient stones pressing into your fingertips as you run them along the walls. Outside, the wind howls and rattles wooden shutters, and somewhere deeper in the castle, a distant door creaks, an ominous sign that these kings' ghostly echoes still roam. And you probably won't survive this. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And as always, let me know where you're listening from and what time it is. Are you a night owl like me, or maybe an early riser? Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You trudge deeper, candle sputtering in your hand. The flame dances, casting shadows like skeletal fingers reaching across the floor. This isn't just any night's walk though, you're about to peer into the reigns of men whose names still make history teachers raise an eyebrow. These kings, some crowned in stolen blood, others in bitter tears, weren't just feared for their power. They were feared for the way they bent that power, the way they wrapped cruelty in velvet cloaks and paraded it through their stone-cold halls. The first whispers you catch tonight are not of gentle monarchs, but of greed-soaked tax collectors in the name of King John of England. Historians still argue whether John was truly as villainous as he's been painted, or simply an unlucky scapegoat of political turmoil. But one thing's clear, his name was mud in the minds of his people. In the flickering candlelight of the early 13th century, John's taxes were a heavy yoke squeezing coins from farmers who could barely feed their children. His demands grew sharper as his wars grew costlier. He needed ships, soldiers, and shiny trinkets to dazzle his court. So he took, and he took again. You imagine yourself in a smoky medieval tavern listening to hushed curses against this soft sword of a king. They called him that because of his inability to hold Normandy, a land his ancestors had fought so hard to win. The nobles grumbled over their cups, but the peasants, the ones breaking their backs for bread, felt the real sting. John's taxmen arrived like dark omens, shaking every last penny from trembling hands. And if you couldn't pay well, let's just say your home might suddenly look like the king's new storehouse. By 1215, enough was enough. The barons, their patience shredded like old parchment, forced John to sign the Magna Carta. A heavy Latin document sealed with his royal wax, it promised that even a king must respect certain rights. Of course, the ink was barely dry before John tried to wriggle free of its constraints. He'd rather fight than lose his divine grip on power. But that parchment was a seed planted deep in the cold soil of history that would sprout into ideas of liberty and justice centuries later. Not that John cared about planting seeds, he cared about his next meal, his next conquest, his next pile of silver. There's a quirky little footnote here. The man who sealed the Magna Carta was rumoured to have lost the crown jewels in quicksand in the Wash, a tidal estuary that swallowed everything from carts to soldiers. Imagine a king's finest treasures glinting beneath a grey tidal sludge, forever lost to the sea's cold embrace. It's almost poetic, the earth itself refusing to hold John's ill-gotten gains. You pause in the hallway, the flickering flame almost sputtering out. Outside, thunder rumbles a low warning from the heavens themselves. John's death in 1216 was not heroic. He died of dysentery, a fittingly grim end for a man who drained his people dry. Historians still argue whether he was simply overwhelmed by impossible odds or genuinely monstrous in his selfishness. But the common folk didn't split hairs. To them, John was the devil in a king's robes, a leech at the throat of the land. And so you press on your footsteps, echoing as if you're walking not just down this corridor but straight through the centuries. You can almost hear the murmurs of villagers paying one last tribute to the man they called a tyrant, forced to scrape coins from the dirt while he sat feasting on roasted swans. A king's table groaning with silver platters, while outside the children's bellies growled with hunger. Yet even as the story of King John echoes down these haunted halls, you realise he's just the first in our lineup of medieval monarchs, whose names make the shadows flicker. Ahead, the doors creak open to reveal Richard II, a king whose vanity turned to fury. But before we meet him, take a moment to adjust your blanket, maybe lean back a little further into the darkness. Let the wind outside become a gentle lullaby, and let your mind settle into the story's soft hum. Because tonight it's not just about the kings themselves, but the way their stories still swirl in the midnight air like embers refusing to die out, no matter how cold the world becomes. You press onward into the flickering corridor, your candles glow, guiding you deeper into this medieval labyrinth. The walls themselves seem to sigh as you enter the world of Richard II, a king so obsessed with his own grandeur that it became a gilded trap. The tapestries on the stone walls shimmer with images of royal feasts and coronations, but behind those woven threads lurk secrets and whispers of fear. Richard II was only 10 years old when he became king. Imagine being that young and crowned with such heavy expectation. You'd think the weight of the crown would humble him, but no. For Richard, it became a mirror reflecting back only his own dazzling self-importance. Historians still argue whether his arrogance was learned or simply baked into his royal bones, but one thing is certain, he turned the throne into his personal stage. You picture Richard strutting through the glittering halls of Westminster velvet robes, sweeping the rush-covered floors, his court filled with poets and flatterers. He demanded to be called Your Highness instead of the more humble Your Grace, as if he were born not just to rule, but to dazzle. And dazzle he did, at least for a while. He was known for his love of luxurious feasts, golden goblets, brimming with spiced wine, and minstrels who sang his praises until their throats went hoarse. But even the brightest masks can crack, and Richard's did so spectacularly. Beneath the soft furs and silk there was a fury that seethed like molten iron. He might have been the poet king, but he was also a ruler who wouldn't tolerate dissent. In 1381 the peasants' revolt roared across England, a storm of pitchforks and torches of common folk, tired of endless taxes and hungry children. Richard was just 14, yet he rode out to meet them, calm as a marble statue. Some say he spoke to them with honeyed words, promising reforms he had no intention of keeping. Later, when the dust settled and the peasants went home, Richard's true colours shone. He turned on the ringleaders with cold precision, having them drawn and quartered in public squares. You can almost hear the drums of execution, the nervous gasps of the crowd as heads rolled to keep a teenage king's pride intact. Historians still argue whether this was Richard's ruthless streak or simply the iron fist of a child king trying to prove himself. But those gallows, heavy with bodies, tell their own tale. Years passed, and Richard's obsession with control only grew. He surrounded himself with sycophants men who fed his vanity like sugar to a spoiled child. If you didn't bow deep enough or flatter his every word, you might find yourself in the Tower of London staring at damp stones and waiting for the executioner's axe. One of those men who dared to question him was Thomas of Woodstock, Richard's uncle. Thomas vanished under mysterious circumstances in 1397. Some whispered of a secret murder ordered by the king himself. No proof, of course, just the kind of ghost story that lingers in castle halls. Richard's downfall was as dramatic as his life. In 1399, his cousin Henry Bolingbroke returned from exile with an army and a vengeance. Richard, so used to velvet flattery, couldn't stand against real steel. He was deposed and imprisoned in Pontefract Castle. There in the damp shadows he wasted away, some say from starvation, others from murder by cold-blooded order. Historians still argue whether his death was a mercy or a final act of cruelty, but either way the Poet King's story ended in darkness. There's a curious tidbit for you. In the centuries after his death, some claimed Richard's ghost haunted the tower rooms where he died, moaning about his lost glory. Superstitious peasants believed that his spirit would forever wander, clutching an empty sceptre and weeping for his lost throne. You smile at the thought, because even a ghost can't change the fact that Richard's vanity and wrath shaped his legacy in iron and blood. Your footsteps echo as you move deeper down this darkened corridor, your candles glow, reflecting off shields and suits of armour. Richard II's story is just one link in the long chain of kings whose pride became their noose. Ahead, another door creaks open, the faint smell of incense wafting through. Edward II awaits you next, with tales of betrayal and whispered scandal that would make even Richard's luxurious court seem almost quaint, so tuck yourself in a little tighter. Let the darkness outside become a lullaby as you drift closer to the next chapter in this midnight journey. There's more to come, so much more, and tonight you'll hear it all. You slip further into the twisting corridors of history, the flickering light of your candle leading you straight to Edward II, a king whose name echoes with scandal and shadows. You feel the air grow heavier as you step into his court, where whispered rumours and secret alliances festered like damp rot beneath the castle stones. Edward II was never meant to be a king of legends. Unlike his father, Edward assumes the mighty hammer of the Scots. Edward III's legacy was more of a cautionary tale. Historians still argue whether he was truly incompetent or simply outmatched by the schemers around him. But what's certain is that he ruled with his heart, and often his heart made a mess of things. From the moment Edward took the throne in 1307, he made it clear that he preferred the company of his favourites to the stuffy old nobles who clung to their ancient rights. One name in particular rises from the shadows, Piers Gaveston. Gaveston, Edward's closest companion, and some say his lover. The two of them were inseparable, sharing laughter and luxuries while the kingdom seethed. Gaveston was given lands, titles and power, and the barons, well, let's just say they weren't exactly fans. You can almost hear the clatter of armour and the hiss of angry whispers as the barons plotted in candlelit chambers. Gaveston's arrogance didn't help. He wore fine silks, threw lavish feasts, and mocked the old nobility to their faces. It was like waving a red flag in front of a bull. Eventually the barons forced Edward to banish Gaveston, but love, or something dangerously close to it, knows no borders. Gaveston returned, and Edward's defiance turned to fury. The barons captured Gaveston in 1312, dragging him from a lonely Welsh castle to a grisly end. He was beheaded on a windswept hill, his head stuck on a pike, as a warning to any other favourites who might dare to climb so high. Edward's grief was as deep as a winter well, but his kingdom didn't pause to mourn. Civil war flared like wildfire. The barons, led by the Earl of Lancaster, demanded more control, while Edward clung to his throne with trembling hands. There's a quirky footnote to this tale. Edward's hobbies weren't quite what you'd expect of a king. He loved manual labour, digging ditches, thatching roofs, even helping to build walls. Some chroniclers found it downright scandalous that a king would rather swing a hammer than a sword, but it did little to calm the barons' fury. They saw a king who played peasant while the realm burned. Historians still argue whether Edward was naive or simply blinded by affection. But one thing's clear, his reign was a disaster of betrayals and missteps. In 1326, his wife, Queen Isabella, returned from France with her lover Roger Mortimer and an army at her back. Edward fled, but there was nowhere to hide. He was captured and forced to abdicate in favour of his young son Edward III. Now comes the part that makes even the bravest historians wince. Edward II died in 1327 and rumours swirled about the manner of his end. Some said he was smothered beneath a heavy mattress, others whispered of a red-hot poker driven into his body as punishment for his unnatural affections. Was it true? Historians still argue, and the official record is suspiciously vague. But the horror of that tale lingers like smoke in the winter air, a reminder that in the medieval world even kings could meet the most gruesome of ends. You feel the chill of the dungeon's stone floor beneath your bare feet as you imagine Edward's final moments. There's no candle bright enough to banish that darkness completely. Even centuries later, the rumours of Edward's death have become legend, one of those twisted bedtime stories whispered to frightened children and scholars alike. But the story doesn't end in the shadow of that grim cell. Edward III, his son, would rise to become one of England's most celebrated kings, casting his father's tragic legacy aside like a tattered cloak. You realise, though, that Edward VI's tale is more than just a scandal, it's a lesson. A lesson that a crown is only as strong as the loyalty of those who wear it, and that a heart left unchecked can be the most dangerous throne of all. As you move away from Edward II's haunted legacy, the corridors twist once more, drawing you deeper into the flickering past. Ahead you can almost smell the incense of a French cathedral, hear the muttered prayers of a kingdom cracking beneath the weight of a king's madness. Charles VI of France waits for you there, his story, a fragile glass crown ready to shatter in the softest breeze. So snuggle in tighter, wrap that blanket a little closer. Let the wind outside become your lullaby as we step into the world of a king who believed he was made of glass. The candle's glow shivers as you step into the echoing halls of Charles VI of France, a king whose reign was a swirling nightmare of fragility and fear. You feel the cold marble beneath your feet, the faint scent of incense clinging to ancient tapestries. Here in the flickering candlelight you find a king whose mind was as fragile as the glass he believed himself to be. Charles VI took the throne in 1380, a boy of 11 who watched his kingdom fracture like a cracked mirror. At first, the kingdom's affairs were steered by his uncle's men who smelled of iron and ambition. But Charles was not content to be a puppet. He took the reins in his early 20s, determined to rule with a steady hand. Historians still argue whether those early years were promising or simply a prelude to the tragedy to come. The first signs of Charles's madness appeared in 1392. Picture this: a hunting party deep in the forest, horses snorting in the cool morning air, the rhythmic thud of hooves on mossy earth. Charles rides at the front, his banner snapping above him. Suddenly he stops. His eyes go wide, and with a wild cry he draws his sword and slashes at his companions. The forest echoes with shouts and the clash of steel as his men struggle to restrain their king. When the fury subsides, Charles slumps in the saddle, silent and trembling. Some say he didn't even remember what he'd done. The court was thrown into chaos. Was it witchcraft? A curse? The doctors of the time, armed with leeches and potions, could offer no cure, and so began the long, dark dance of Charles's madness. At times he believed he was made of glass, so delicate that even a touch could shatter him. He wore iron rods sewn into his clothes to protect his fragile bones. You imagine him pacing the cold halls of the Louvre, his steps cautious, his eyes darting with a desperate fear. One careless bump, one accidental shove, and he thought he would shatter like a window in a winter storm. Historians still argue whether Charles's condition was what we'd now call schizophrenia, or perhaps some other form of mental illness. But for those who lived under his rule, the diagnosis hardly mattered. The king's madness became a kingdom's nightmare. The court split into factions, each hungry for power in the chaos. His wife, Queen Isabeau, manoeuvred like a chess master, forging alliances and striking deals behind the silken curtains of her chamber. and the king's brother, Louis of Orléans, was always nearby, whispering, plotting, waiting for the perfect moment. The people of France watched their king's decline with a mixture of pity and dread. One chronicler noted that Charles would sometimes wander the halls in a daze, his hair wild, his robes slipping from his shoulders, and in those rare moments of clarity he would weep for the kingdom he could no longer truly rule. The French called him Charles the Mad, a cruel title that stuck like a burr in his bloodline. Yet even in the depths of his madness, Charles could still surprise. There's a curious detail you might enjoy once during a lucid interval he threw a magnificent party known as the Bal des Ardents, or the Ball of the Burning Men. It was meant to be a night of laughter and revelry, but a stray torch set the dancers' costumes alight, costumes made of pitch and flax. Flames leapt through the hall and Charles himself nearly burned alive. Historians still argue whether this was a mere accident or a symbol of the madness that always hovered just beyond his reach. You feel the weight of this tragedy as you walk on. The kingdom was a tapestry of blood and betrayal woven tighter with every passing year. The 100 Years' War raged on English archers and French knights, tearing at each other like wolves in the night. And there was Charles trapped in a mind that flickered like your candle's flame, powerless to stop the kingdom from slipping through his trembling fingers. In the end, Charles lived a long life by medieval standards, dying in 1422. But his mind had long since retreated to a place where glass bones and iron rods were the only truth. His death marked the end of an era, but the seeds of his madness had already sprouted into a forest of intrigue and war. The Burgundians and Armagnacs, the English invaders and French defenders, each of them played their part in the kingdom's long bitter struggle. You pause at a heavy oak door, its hinges groaning like the bones of an old knight. Beyond it lies the next chapter in our midnight wanderings, King Wenceslaus IV of Bohemia, whose vices and misrule turned the golden halls of Prague into a kingdom of scandal. But for now let the darkness cradle you a little longer. Let the echoes of Charles VI's fragile reign whisper you to sleep a lullaby of glass and iron in the night. You push open the heavy oak door and step into a world of opulent halls and scandalous whispers, the kingdom of King Wenceslaus IV of Bohemia. The air here feels thick with wine and smoke, the echoes of drunken songs fading into the shadows. You walk softly, candlelight dancing off gilt icons and dusty tomes. Here was a king who might have ruled a golden city, but instead let it tarnish beneath his careless hands. Wenceslaus IV, son of the great emperor. Charles IV was born into a legacy that should have been a crown of light. His father's reign was one of learning and glory universities, built cathedrals raised like prayers of stone. But Wenceslaus, well, historians still argue whether he was a fool, a puppet, or simply a man who wanted too much pleasure and too little responsibility. He took the throne in 1378, and for a while the kingdom of Bohemia glittered like the crown jewels he wore. Wenceslaus was clever in his own way, charming enough to keep the nobles at bay at least for a time, but his rule quickly slipped into scandal. He drank too much, caroused too loudly, and let the weight of governance slide off his shoulders like a velvet cloak on a summer's day. One of the most peculiar bits of Wenceslaus's reign was his fondness for animals. Chroniclers tell of the king's strange delight in keeping exotic beasts, including a menagerie of bears and wolves in the castle courtyard. The common folk must have watched in bewilderment as their king, red-cheeked from drink, laughed with his creatures while ignoring petitions and pleas. Historians still argue whether this was simple eccentricity or a sign of a mind teetering on the edge, but the animals were just a footnote in the symphony of Wenceslaus's misrule. The real trouble began when he clashed with the church. The Pope demanded obedience, but Wenceslaus, ever the stubborn mule, refused to bow. He protected reformers like Jan Hus, a preacher whose fiery sermons set Prague ablaze with talk of change. The nobles grumbled, the church fumed, and Wenceslaus, he just poured another cup of wine. The kingdom of Bohemia was soon a house divided. Wenceslaus's half-brother Sigismund, hungry for power, began to scheme. In 1394, a group of nobles kidnapped Wenceslaus in a daring plot that reads like a medieval soap opera. They locked him away in a castle tower, the echoes of his protests muffled by cold stone and iron bars. Yet somehow Wenceslaus survived this coup, maybe through luck, maybe through the loyalty of friends who remembered a gentler king beneath the drink. Historians still argue whether Wenceslaus truly deserved the title the Lazy, or whether he was simply overwhelmed by the chaos of the times. What's certain is that his later years were a slow, spiralling decline. He was stripped of the title of a Holy Roman Emperor, no small disgrace for a man born to rule half of Europe. But even as he lost crowns and titles, he never lost his taste for pleasure. You can almost hear the clink of goblets and the soft strum of lutes as the king toasted away his kingdom's future. Wenceslaus died in 1419, his body found in bed after a night of drinking that never ended. Some say it was a peaceful passing, others whisper of poison in his wine. Historians still argue, of course they do, because every good medieval mystery needs its shadow of doubt. The legacy he left was a kingdom poised on the brink. Jan Hus's sermons would soon ignite the Hussite Wars, a fiery chapter of faith and blood that would consume Bohemia for decades. And Wenceslaus, he would be remembered not as a warrior or a saint, but as a cautionary tale of what happens when a crown grows too heavy for a weary head. You step away from the soft glow of the Bohemian halls, the air growing colder as you move forward. The next door opens with a soft creak and you feel a sudden chill, like breath against your neck. Ahead waits Vlad the Impaler, a name that still makes even the bravest souls shiver. His is a story of forests filled with stakes and a reputation that has become legend. So pull that blanket tighter, my friend. Let the wind rattle the windows, let the darkness outside become your lullaby. Because in the next chapter of this midnight wander, you'll walk straight into the land of Vlad, where mercy was a word rarely spoken, and fear was the only law that mattered. You step into the cold forests of Eastern Europe, where the moon hangs low and pale above the dark trees. Here the wind moans through ancient branches like a choir of lost souls, and every shadow feels like a pair of watching eyes. You've arrived in the land of Vlad the Impaler, a man whose name alone can make your skin prickle. His castle rises in the distance, a silhouette of stone and iron that seems to breathe with every gust of icy wind. Vlad III, known as Vlad Tepes, or simply the Impaler, was born in 1431 in Transylvania, a region caught between empires and always bracing for war. His father was Vladsen Dracul the Dragon, a man who wore the Order of the Dragon's insignia and taught his son that a ruler's strength was measured in blood and iron. Vlad III would take those lessons to terrifying heights. Historians still argue whether Vlad was a mad butcher or a necessary tyrant after all his enemies were everywhere. The Ottoman Turks pressed in from the east, while the Hungarian king eyed Transylvania's rich lands from the west. Vlad's childhood was a swirl of shifting alliances and cold betrayals. At just 11 years old, he and his brother Radu were taken as hostages by the Ottomans. Imagine the fear of a boy locked in foreign towers, taught to bow to a sultan who would rather see him broken than free. Years later, Vlad returned home to reclaim his father's throne. But this was no fairy tale homecoming. He found a kingdom torn by feuding boyars, where power was as fleeting as the flicker of your candle's flame. Vlad decided to forge his own destiny, one sharpened by iron stakes and rivers of blood. The stories of his cruelty became legend. He invited his enemies to lavish feasts only to have them seized at the table and impaled on long sharpened stakes. Rows upon rows of bodies swaying like a forest of the dead warned friend and foe alike that this was a land where mercy had no place. One Turkish envoy, so the tale goes, refused to remove his hat in Vlad's court. Vlad nailed the hat to his head rather than tolerate disrespect. Historians still argue whether this is fact or grim folklore, but the point remains in Vlad's realm every slight was a mortal insult. There's a curious tidbit about Vlad's tactics. Some say he used impalement not just for punishment, but as psychological warfare. Imagine an invading army marching into Wallachia only to be met with thousands of impaled corpses lining the roads. The stench of death, the buzz of flies, the knowledge that this was a man who would stop at nothing. Even the hardened soldiers of the Ottoman Empire turned back at the sight, their courage withering beneath the weight of Vlad's horror. But beneath the blood and terror there was a ruler who kept his realm from collapse. Vlad strengthened his fortress at Poenary, perched high on a cliff like a bird of prey. He minted coins with his fierce visage, ensuring his people knew who held the true power. He rooted out the corrupt boyars who had betrayed his father, forcing them to rebuild his castles stone by stone. Historians still argue whether he was a patriot defending his land or a tyrant driven mad by vengeance. Perhaps he was both, because in the flickering candlelight of history the line between saviour and monster is always blurred. Vlad's final years were as shadowy as his reign. In 1476 he died in battle, or perhaps was assassinated by treacherous hands within his own court. His head was sent to the Ottoman Sultan as proof of his death, a grisly trophy for a man who had once been their prisoner. But even in death, Vlad's legend refused to fade. Peasants whispered that his ghost still roamed the Carpathian forests, searching for traitors to impale beneath the pale light of the moon. You feel the chill of those woods pressing against your skin, the distant cries of wolves echoing through the trees. Vlad the Impaler's story is one of blood and steel, but also of a man caught between empires and determined to carve his mark into the earth no matter how many stakes it took. You take a step back from the edge of those haunted forests, the memory of Vlad's empire of fear lingering in the shadows. Ahead lies a kingdom of family feuds and bitter rivalries, a court where brother turned against brother in a dance of knives. Peter the Cruel of Castile waits in the next chamber, his reign a cold tapestry of betrayal and bloodshed. So settle in closer to the fire, friend. Let the wind outside lull you into a deeper calm, even as these ancient halls whisper of kings whose names will never die. Because in the next chapter, you'll see how even the warm sun of Spain couldn't melt the icy heart of Peter the Cruel. The shadows grow deeper as you walk into the realm of Peter the Cruel, King of Castile. The Spanish sun might be warm, but here in his court the air is cold with suspicion and betrayal. You feel the chill seep into your bones as you step over mosaic floors, the candlelight flickering on tiled walls that have seen more blood than any battlefield. Peter the Y of Castile, known to history as Peter the Cruel, ruled from 1350 to 1369, a reign of bright feasts and darker deeds. Historians still argue whether he was truly as monstrous as his enemies claimed, or simply a hard ruler in a hard age. But one thing is certain, his name still makes Spanish grandmothers shiver when they tell bedtime tales. Peter's court was a tangle of secrets. He rose to power as a young king, handsome and fiercely intelligent, but with a will as cold as a winter river. His reign was marked by endless family feuds, half-brothers who plotted in the shadows, cousins who schemed in silk-lined chambers. The walls themselves seemed to whisper of betrayal, the tapestries drinking in each secret like thirsty sponges. One of the most notorious tales is how Peter dealt with his stepmother, Leonor de Guzman. She had been his father's beloved mistress, a woman of power in her own right. But Peter saw only a threat to his rule. He had her imprisoned and some say ordered her death with a flick of his hand. A quiet execution in a lonely tower, no trumpets, no last words, just a final gasp in the darkness. Historians still argue whether Peter truly ordered it, or whether the execution was the work of ambitious courtiers. But in a reign built on blood and suspicion, the truth often drowned in silence. The family drama didn't end there. Peter's half-brother Henry of Trastamara was a thorn in his side, one who would grow into a dagger aimed at his throat. Henry claimed Peter was a tyrant, a king who cared more for his own pleasures than for his people. Some say Peter's cruelty was real harsh taxes, brutal justice, a reign of fear. Others claim Henry was just another ambitious prince spinning tales to cloak his own ambitions. Historians still argue, of course. They always do. And yet there's a strange detail in this storm of violence. Peter loved a woman named Maria de Padilla, with a devotion that seems almost tender. Her name was whispered in poems and songs, her beauty said to be as soft as the moonlight over the Guadalquivir River. When she died, Peter mourned her as a king might mourn a kingdom, his grief deep and wild, a storm that shook even his iron heart. But love wasn't enough to save him. As Henry's forces gathered, Peter's paranoia grew sharper than any dagger. He executed enemies by the dozens, sometimes on the slimmest of pretexts. The prisons of Seville and Toledo overflowed with the cries of those who dared to challenge him. You can almost hear those cries echo down the corridors, a grim lullaby in the dark. In 1369, Peter's story reached its bloody climax. At the Battle of Montiel, Henry and Peter faced each other in a final clash of steel and hate. There's a chilling footnote to this: the two half-brothers met in a tent to parley supposedly under truce. But in that cramped canvas room, Henry lunged with the dagger, and Peter fell beneath the weight of fraternal betrayal. Some chroniclers claim the dagger blow was the final twist in a lifelong feud. Others hint at a struggle so fierce that the very tent poles rattled with their fury. After Peter's death, Henry took the throne and spread tales of Peter's monstrous cruelty far and wide. Peter the Cruel, he was called, forever remembered as the king who drank the blood of his own kin. But in the flickering shadows of history, some still wonder, was he truly a beast? Or was he simply a man caught in the jaws of medieval politics, where mercy was as rare as a summer snow? You linger in the heavy silence, feeling the weight of centuries pressing in. The tapestries seem to watch you, their woven faces unreadable. Ahead lies a kingdom of snow and iron, where the bitter winds of Russia carve the soul as sharply as any blade. Ivan the Terrible awaits his name, a whisper of dread that chills the heart even now. So settle back, my friend. Let the night wrap around you like a velvet cloak. The next chapter of our midnight wander will take you deep into the frostbitten forests of Russia, where Ivan's wrath was as endless as the winter itself. The corridors grow darker, and the air turns sharp with winter's breath as you step into the realm of Ivan IV of Russia, the man history knows as Ivan the Terrible. Here the candlelight trembles in the icy draught, and you can almost feel the weight of fur-lined cloaks and iron-cold crowns. Every breath in this place tastes of frost and foreboding. Ivan was crowned Grand Prince of Moscow in 1533, but his childhood was a cradle of nightmares. Orphaned young, he grew up in the Kremlin's labyrinthine halls, surrounded by scheming nobles and sharp-tongued advisors who would have seen him a puppet, not a prince. Historians still argue whether it was these bitter beginnings that seeded the darkness in Ivan's soul, or if the cruelty was always there, coiled like a serpent waiting for the right moment to strike. He was the first to take the title of Tsar of all Russia, a word that echoed with divine right and absolute power, and Ivan wore it like a second skin, ruling with a hand that was both iron and ice. At first, his reign promised to be a new dawn. He reformed the government, built cathedrals that reached towards the heavens, and opened trade routes to the west. But behind the golden domes and silver bells, Ivan's paranoia simmered a pot always on the edge of boiling over. You can almost hear the clang of iron-shod boots as his oprichniki, his black-robed enforcers, rode through the snowy streets of Moscow. They were Ivan's personal army of terror, their black horses a shadow in the white drifts. Historians still argue about how many they killed, some say thousands, others tens of thousands. But the stories of their cruelty echo like the howl of wolves in the Russian night. There's a quirky footnote for you. Ivan loved books and was fascinated by astrology, poring over celestial charts, even as his realm bled. Picture a king who believed the stars themselves conspired against him, studying the heavens with a scholar's eye, while his enemies vanished into cold, unmarked graves. He was a man of contradictions, capable of quoting scripture one moment and ordering executions the next. Perhaps the most chilling chapter of Ivan's rule was the massacre of Novgorod in 1570. Convinced the city had betrayed him, Ivan's fury became a river of blood. His troops descended on Novgorod with axes and torches, slaughtering men, women and children. The bells of the city's great cathedral rang out in mourning as the streets ran red. Historians still argue whether this was a calculated move to break Novgorod's power, or the mad wrath of a tyrant who saw enemies in every shadow. And yet amid this reign of terror, Ivan showed glimpses of a broken heart. His beloved wife, Anastasia Romanovna, died young, some say poisoned by scheming boyars. Her death shattered what little warmth there was in Ivan's soul. He believed she'd been taken from him by traitors, and from that moment his vengeance was endless. Even his own son, Ivan Ivanovich, was not safe. In a fit of rage, Ivan struck him down with his staff in 1581, a single blow that snuffed out his heir and left Ivan wailing in grief over the lifeless body. You can almost hear that wail echo through the centuries, a father's anguish swallowed by the snows of history. Ivan died in 1584, slumped over a chessboard, his heart finally too tired to beat. Some say the chessboard was a symbol of his endless games, moving pieces, sacrificing pawns, always playing to win even as the world crumbled around him. Historians still argue whether Ivan was a monster of his own making, or a product of a world that demanded cruelty to survive. But in the cold corridors of memory, his name endures a shadow cast by candlelight, a name that still makes the heart shiver. You pause for a moment, the cold air biting at your cheeks. Beyond these frozen halls lies a kingdom of tangled politics and hopeless kings, where weakness was not just a flaw, it was a death sentence. Ethelred the Unready waits there, a monarch who stumbled when the world needed strength. So pull your blanket closer, let the winter wind sing you a lullaby, and prepare to step into the next chapter of this midnight wander. You leave the snow-dusted corridors of Ivan the Terrible's Russia and step into the damp, misty fields of medieval England, where the soft earth squelches beneath your feet and the grey sky hangs heavy overhead. Here waits a king whose very name suggests he was never quite ready for the burdens of the crown Ethelred the Unready. Ethelred ascended to the throne in 978, a boy of just 10 years old. The kingdom was still reeling from the murder of his older brother Edward the Martyr, a killing some whisper Ethelred's own mother might have orchestrated. Historians still argue whether Ethelred was complicit, or just a puppet in the bloody schemes of others. But from the moment the crown was pressed onto his young head, Ethelred's rule was haunted by blood and doubt. His nickname, Unready, doesn't quite mean what you might think. It comes from the Old English unread meaning poor counsel. A king ill-advised, fumbling in the dark while the wolves of the north closed in. And close in they did. The Viking raids that had once been sporadic now became a relentless tide, sweeping up England's coasts and villages in a swirl of axes and fire. You can almost hear the clang of swords and the crackle of burning thatch as the Danes pushed deeper into the land. Ethelred, ever uncertain, tried to buy them off. He paid the Danegeld, a tax raised from his already weary people, tribute meant to make the raiders go away. But gold only whetted their appetite. The more he paid, the more they came like sharks drawn by the scent of blood. There's a curious tidbit here. One of Ethelred's payments to the Vikings was so large it emptied the royal treasury. Picture chests of silver enough to make a dragon's horde jealous carted off to the longships that line the English shores. Some say the Danes even weighed the coins in bushels, so great was the ransom. Historians still argue whether this was cowardice or simply a desperate gamble in a game Ethelred was always destined to lose. His advisors didn't help matters. The kingdom was a nest of rival nobles, each pulling Ethelred this way and that, whispering promises and threats in the same breath. In 1002, Ethelred ordered the massacre of all Danes living in England, the St. Brice's Day massacre. It was meant to be a show of strength, but it only invited more fury. The Danes came back led by the fearsome swine Forkbeard, and soon the kingdom was drowning in blood once more. Ethelred fled to Normandy in 1013, a king without a kingdom, his family huddled around him in exile. Some say he wept every night, haunted by the weight of a crown that had always been too heavy for his brow. But even in exile, the crown called him back. When Sweyn died, Ethelred returned to England desperate to reclaim the throne. Historians still argue whether this was courage or simply the last gasp of a drowning man. His final years were no happier. The kingdom was a patchwork of truces and betrayals, as fragile as the mist that clung to the river banks at dawn. Ethelred died in 1016, leaving behind a realm that was battered and exhausted, ready to fall into the hands of Cnut the Dane. The unready king left no legacy of triumph, just a kingdom that had learned to flinch at every shadow on the horizon. You pause in the corridor, the chill of the past pressing close. Beyond this chapter of muddled plans and hollow promises waits a monarch whose power was anything but uncertain. Henry VIII, with his towering presence and iron will, stands in the next room, his story a feast of ambition, wives and heads that rolled at his command. So lean back into the darkness, my friend. Let the cold English mist slip away as you drift closer to the world of Henry, a king who would have seen Ethelred's hesitance as a crime in itself. Because in the next chapter, the crown is not a burden to be feared, but a prize to be taken by force. You move from the trembling shadows of Ethelred's England to the thunderous halls of Henry VIII, a king who needed no introduction and left no room for mercy. The air here is thick with the scent of roasted meats and sweet perfumes, the clatter of goblets and the sharp clash of steel behind velvet tapestries. This is not a place for doubt. This is Henry's court, where the king's will was law, and every word could cost you your head. Henry was born in 1491, the golden second son of the Tudor dynasty. Historians still argue whether he was shaped more by ambition or by a deep-seated fear of losing everything his father had won. From the moment he ascended the throne in 1509, Henry was determined to be more than a king. He wanted to be a legend. And for better or worse, that's exactly what he became. You picture him in his prime, broad-shouldered, red-gold hair, glinting like the summer sun, his laughter filling the feasting halls. He was a man of appetites, food, drink, music, jousting, and those appetites burned like a forge, always hungry for more. But beneath the laughter and the bright silks was a mind as sharp as any dagger. Henry's reign was marked by an endless hunger for power, and an equally endless fear of losing it. When his first wife, Catherine of Aragon, failed to give him a son, Henry didn't see it as the will of God. He saw it as an insult, a crack in his carefully constructed image of invincible kingship. The idea of annulment wasn't just a personal matter, it became a royal obsession, that would tear England away from the Catholic Church itself. You can almost hear the gasps and murmurs of the court as Henry turned his back on Rome, declaring himself supreme head of the Church of England. The monasteries were dissolved, their treasures seized to fill the royal coffers. Historians still argue whether Henry truly believed he was divinely justified, or if he was simply grasping for control no matter the cost. There's a curious footnote here. Henry was once a devout Catholic, even earning the title Defender of the Faith for his writings against Martin Luther. Picture a king who penned treatises for the Pope one year and seized the Pope's power the next, an echo of the unpredictable fury that defined his rule. The most famous echoes of Henry's reign are of course the fates of his 6 wives. Divorced, beheaded, died. Divorced, beheaded, survived. The old rhyme goes a grim litany of women who tried to love a man whose heart was as restless as the sea. Catherine of Aragon, Anne Boleyn, Jane Seymour, Anne of Cleves. Catherine Howard and Catherine Parr each played their part in Henry's personal drama, their lives hanging by the fragile thread of his affection. You can almost see the haunted faces of these queens in the candlelight, their fates tied to a man who could turn from tenderness to terror in a single breath. Anne Boleyn's execution in 1536, the French swordsman's blade gleaming in the morning sun, is a moment that still chills the blood. Historians still argue whether Anne was guilty of treason or simply of failing to give Henry the son he craved. But in the end, her head rolled all the same. By the final years of his reign, Henry's once golden hair had turned white, and his body was as swollen and sore as his heart. Gout and an old jousting wound left him in constant pain, but his mind was as sharp and suspicious as ever. Even in the shadows of his own death, he reached for control, demanding that no one question the legacy he'd built with blood and iron. Henry died in 1547, leaving behind a kingdom that was forever changed, a land torn from the Pope's grasp where English was spoken in the Mass and the old ways lay broken like the monastery's shattered stones. Some remember him as a tyrant, others as a visionary king who forged modern England from the ashes of tradition. Historians still argue, of course, because Henry's shadow is too vast to ever truly fade. You step softly away from his haunted court, the scent of roses and spilled blood clinging to your cloak. Beyond these gilded halls waits another king, whose ruin came not from too much ambition, but from the weight of debt and despair. John II of France, a monarch caught in the snares of ransom and ruin. So leaning closer to the flickering light, friend, let the echoes of Henry's court fade into the night as we drift onward to the story of a king whose ransom nearly bankrupted a kingdom, a tale of gold and shame that lingers in the hush of medieval halls. You leave the opulent courts of Henry VIII behind and wander now into the quiet, candlelit chambers of John II of France, a king whose story is laced with the clinking of coin and the rustle of velvet, but always under the cold shadow of captivity. The halls here are lined with heraldic banners, their silken folds heavy with the weight of lost battles and endless debts. John II, called John the Good, took the throne in 1350. But in the biting winds of the 100 Years' War, no name could shield him from the chaos that lay ahead. Historians still argue whether he was a king undone by his own chivalry, or by the cunning of his enemies. But from the moment he donned the crown, his fate seemed bound to a single costly word: ransom. In 1356, at the Battle of Poitiers, John faced the English under the command of Edward the Black Prince. Imagine the clang of steel and the war cries echoing across the green fields of France. John fought bravely, they say, clad in gleaming plate armour, his standard waving above the din. But bravery wasn't enough. He was captured, dragged from the battlefield by men who saw a king as nothing more than a purse of gold waiting to be claimed. They took him to England, a prisoner of honour, but a prisoner all the same. You can almost feel the chill of the Tower of London stones against your back, the echo of footsteps in the dim corridors where John paced and planned. Historians still argue whether he was treated as a royal guest or a prized hostage. After all, a captive king was worth more in coin than in comfort. The ransom demanded for John's release was staggering 3 million gold crowns. Picture that some chests of gleaming coins enough to weigh down a dozen ships enough to break the backs of peasants and merchants from Paris to Gascony. France groaned beneath the weight of the king's freedom taxes rising like a tide that swallowed every silver coin. The people cursed and paid their loyalty, stretched thin as the parchment on which the ransom terms were written. Curiously, John was granted certain freedoms in captivity. He was allowed to hold court in the English capital, hosting feasts and tournaments that glittered like the memory of his lost kingdom. Imagine a captive king raising his goblet in a foreign land, the music sweet, but always touched by the bitter note of exile. Yet even in these moments of fragile splendour, he was never truly free, each toast and dance paid for in French blood and gold. When John returned to France in 1360, it wasn't the joyful homecoming you might expect. The kingdom was still bound by the chains of debt, and his son, the future Charles V, struggled to hold the realm together. Worse still, hostages pledged for John's ransom began to slip away noble sons, who saw no reason to languish for a king who seemed to care more for his own dignity than their freedom. Historians still argue about what happened next. In 1363, John made a choice that was either the height of honour or the depths of foolishness. He returned voluntarily to English captivity because the terms of his ransom had not been met. Can you imagine that a king riding back into prison, choosing the cold stone of his cell over the broken promises of a kingdom that could not pay? Some say it was an act of chivalry, others say it was a man desperate to prove he was still a king, even if only in chains. John died in London in 1364, never to see his kingdom again. His heart was buried with him, a lonely relic of a monarch who ruled in exile as much as he did in France. His story is one of shimmering feasts and hollow victories of a crown that was always just out of reach, no matter how many gold coins were piled to claim it. You can almost hear the sigh of relief as you leave his quiet chambers behind. Beyond the flickering torchlight waits another king, a spider in human form, weaving webs of intrigue that snared both friends and enemies. Louis X, the universal spider, is there, his whispers filling the air like 1,000 scuttling feet. So tuck yourself deeper beneath your blanket, friend. Let the echoes of John's captivity slip away as we move into the realm of cunning plots and tangled alliances, a world where the king's mind was the sharpest blade of all. You step forward, the flickering torchlight guiding you deeper into the darkened corridors of Louis XIV, the king they called the Universal Spider. Here the air is filled not with the clang of swords, but with the soft rustle of parchment and the murmurs of secret deals. Every corner seems to watch you, every shadow seems to whisper. This is Louis's domain, where the web of intrigue was spun so fine that even the bravest knights found themselves ensnared. Louis XIV came to the throne of France in 1461, inheriting a kingdom scarred by war and factional strife. He was no grand warrior like the kings of old, no towering figure in armour. He was thin, almost sickly, with a sharp, bird-like face that never seemed to smile without a reason. Historians still argue whether his cunning was born of necessity, or whether he was simply a man who preferred shadows to sunlight. He ruled with a mind like a steel trap, weaving alliances and breaking them with equal ease. Louis preferred the pen to the sword, dispatching letters like arrows to pierce the hearts of his enemies. You can almost hear the scratch of quills in candlelit chambers, each missive a thread in the great web he spun across Europe. He cultivated spies in every court, their reports feeding his hunger for knowledge. A single word out of place, and the king would know his web stretched from the lowliest peasant to the highest noble. There's a curious tidbit about his reign. Louis had a personal astrologer who claimed to read the fates in the stars above. Picture a king poring over charts of constellations, while emissaries waited in antechambers, their pleas and bribes held at bay by the flicker of a single candle. Historians still argue whether Louis truly believed in the power of the heavens, or simply used these portents as another tool in his endless chess game. Louis's court was no glittering palace of chivalry, it was a labyrinth of suspicion and fear. He favoured plain clothing over the jewelled silks of his ancestors, preferring to blend in rather than dazzle. His enemies mocked him as a merchant king more comfortable counting coins than leading charges into battle. But Louis cared little for their scorn. In his mind, every coin counted every alliance measured in the cold light of survival. Perhaps his most famous conquest was not on the battlefield, but in the mind of Charles the bold Duke of Burgundy. Charles was everything Louis was not: brash, warlike, and eager to carve his name into the annals of history with blood and steel. The two men were locked in a silent war of wills, each manoeuvring like pieces on a chessboard, where every move was life or death. Charles would boast and bluster, but Louis would smile, that thin, knowing smile, and always somehow he would win. In 1477, Charles met his end at the Battle of Nancy, his ambitions buried beneath the snow and the boots of Swiss pikemen. Louis's web had held, and Burgundy, once a threat that loomed like a storm cloud, was pulled into the orbit of France. Some say it was the culmination of all Louis's cunning, the final tightening of a snare that had been years in the making. Historians still argue whether Charles's death was fate, or simply the final inevitable outcome of the Spider King's patient plotting. You can almost see Louis in his later years moving through his quiet castle of Plessis-les-Tours. The walls were thick, the windows narrow, built not for beauty but for safety. He surrounded himself with loyal servants, men whose loyalty was bought with gold or fear, and whose lives could be snatched away with a single nod. Even in his final days, Louis never stopped weaving his web, never stopped watching for the next threat. He died in 1483, leaving behind a kingdom more secure than it had been in centuries. Yet his name carried a faint chill, as if the echo of his plotting still lingered in the hush of winter nights. The French would remember him not for gallant battles or shining courts, but for a mind that never slept and a heart that never softened. You pause in the silence, the air heavy with the memory of a king who ruled with a spider's patience and a serpent's bite. Ahead you hear the rustle of silks and the crack of betrayal. Charles II of Navarre, the man they called Charles. The bad waits in the next chapter of your midnight journey. So wrap your blanket tighter, friend. Let the echoes of the Spider King's whispers fade as we step into a tale of poison and treachery, where a king's own kin were his greatest foes. You leave behind the silent corridors of Louis XV and step into a world of crackling firelight and shadows that flicker like conspiracies on the edge of vision. Here in Navarre the air is heavy with the scent of sweet wine and sour betrayal. Charles II of Navarre, called Charles the Bad by those who knew him, waits here a king whose name has become a byword for treachery. Charles was born in 1332, a prince of fine breeding and endless ambition. His kingdom of Navarre was small, a jewel set between France and Spain, but his aspirations stretched far beyond its mountain borders. From the moment he donned the crown in 1349, he was a player in every shadowed game that Europe had to offer. Historians still argue whether he was a master strategist or simply a man who never met a scheme he didn't like. You can almost hear the rustle of velvet as Charles moved through his court, always with the dagger hidden behind the smile. His rivals were many, and he played them like pieces on a chessboard, sometimes friend, sometimes foe, always with an eye on the main chance. He claimed descent from the French royal line, and in the chaotic years of the 100 Years' War that claim was a spark ready to set kingdoms ablaze. One of Charles's most infamous moments was his involvement in the assassination of Charles de la Cerda, the Constable of France. De la Cerda was a trusted advisor to the French king, and Charles of Navarre saw him as an obstacle to his ambitions. In 1354, de la Cerda was murdered, cut down in cold blood, his body left as a message to the French court. Charles denied involvement, of course, but the blood on his hands was hard to wash away. Historians still argue whether he ordered the killing outright or simply let it happen, a deadly whisper in the right ear at the right moment. There's a curious detail here. Charles was known for his love of alchemy and strange potions. Picture a king in the dead of night hunched over copper alembics and glass vials seeking the secrets of gold and immortality. It was said he kept jars of mercury and sulphur hidden in his private chambers, as if he hoped to find the philosopher's stone while the world around him burned. His schemes extended beyond the laboratory, of course. Charles shifted his alliances like the changing of the seasons. One moment he pledged loyalty to the French crown, the next he was in secret talks with the English. His shifting loyalties earned him many enemies and many friends, if only for a moment. The French King John II once imprisoned him to curb his treachery, but Charles was as slippery as the quicksilver he so loved. He talked his way out of prison and back into the game, always one step ahead of the noose. Yet for all his cunning, Charles's end was as grim as any medieval cautionary tale. In 1387 he fell ill. Some say it was a sudden fever, others a punishment from the heavens for his endless betrayals. His death was as strange as his life. Chroniclers claim that in his final days he was wrapped in linen soaked in brandy to warm his failing limbs. But a careless servant let a candle fall, and Charles the Bad was consumed in fire. His last breath, a scream swallowed by the crackling flames. Historians still argue whether this was poetic justice or simple accident, whether the king who had played with fire his entire life finally found it turned against him. Either way, the name Charles the Bad lived on, a whispered warning in the halls of power. You pause in the doorway, the scent of burnt linen and cold stone lingering in the air. Ahead you can almost hear the creak of a bowstring and the thud of an arrow finding its mark. William Rufus waits in the forest, his death as sudden and mysterious as the flicker of your candle. So pull the blanket closer, friend. Let the rustle of conspiracies fade into the hush of the night as we step from the courts of poison to the wild woods of an English king whose death still echoes through the trees. You leave behind the smoky tapestries of Charles the Bad's court and step into the green hush of the English forest, where sunlight filters through the leaves in flickering gold. But there's no peace here, no bird song, only the faint scent of blood, and the echo of a mystery that has never been fully solved. This is the story of William Rufus the King, whose death was as sudden and silent as a shadow slipping between the trees. William II of England, called William Rufus for his ruddy complexion, was the son of William the Conqueror. He took the throne in 1087, a man whose laughter was as loud as his rages, whose feasts could last for days, and whose soldiers knew to tread carefully around his shifting moods. Historians still argue whether he was truly hated or simply feared, a king whose quick temper was matched only by his fierce sense of pride. You can almost see him now riding through the forest of the New Forest, the royal hunting ground where the trees were thick and the game was plentiful. It was August 2nd, 1100, a summer day that began with a bright trill of horns and the clatter of hooves. William rode out with his knights and friends, the air alive with the promise of the hunt. Among them was Walter Tyrrell, a nobleman whose name would be forever linked to the blood that stained the forest floor. Historians still argue whether Walter was truly a friend or merely another courtier vying for the king's favour. What's certain is that as the hunt spread through the trees, an arrow was loosed, and it found its mark in the king's chest. Some say it was an accident, a stray shot meant for the deer that instead found the king's heart. Others whisper of plots and conspiracies of a kingdom that needed a new ruler and a single arrow to make it so. Walter Tyrrell fled the scene, galloping hard through the dusk as the king's lifeblood soaked into the forest moss. Did he flee in terror at an accident, or with the cold calm of an assassin who knew the hour had come? William's body was found by commoners who carried it to Winchester on a cart, no royal litter. No golden bier, just a rough wooden wagon that rattled over the ruts of the forest paths. It's said that as they passed beneath the old oaks, the forest itself fell silent as if the very earth was holding its breath. Historians still argue whether the king's death was the act of fate or of man, but either way it was a kingdom that shifted in that quiet moment. William's reign had been marked by conflict and ambition. He'd fought the church as fiercely as he fought his enemies, clashing with Archbishop Anselm over the rights of kings and clerics. Some saw him as a tyrant who took what he wanted and left the land gasping beneath heavy taxes. Others saw a strong king who kept the barons in check and the kingdom secure. But all agreed William Rufus was not a man to be crossed lightly. There's a curious tidbit for you. Some medieval chroniclers believed William's death was divine judgment. They said his refusal to bow to the church had called down God's wrath, that the arrow in the forest was an angel's bolt, not a mortal one. Even centuries later, the idea of a king struck down by heaven's hand sends a shiver through the candlelit hush of these old halls. You pause now, the forest breath cold against your skin. Ahead waits a king whose mind was as sharp as his sword, a man who ruled with both iron and ink, Frederick II of the Holy Roman Empire. His story is one of wonder and controversy, of science and superstition. A kingdom where the old ways met the new, under the watchful eyes of a man who refused to be ordinary. So settle in deeper, friend. Let the hush of the forest fade into the background as we step forward into the world of Frederick, a world of falcon scholars and a crown that shone as bright as any star. You leave the forest where the arrow found William Rufus and step into the warm, sunlit courts of the Holy Roman Empire, a realm where learning and power moved hand in hand. Here waits Frederick II, the man some called Stupor Mundi, the wonder of the world. His was a reign where reason and ruthlessness walked side by side, where the kingdom was a canvas for his restless mind. Frederick II was crowned Holy Roman Emperor in 1220, and from the start he was a monarch unlike any other. He spoke 6 languages fluently, including Arabic, a skill as rare as the phoenix in the medieval West. Historians still argue whether he was a true humanist ahead of his time, or simply a king whose curiosity knew no limits. You can almost see him now, pacing the sunlit courtyards of Palermo, surrounded by scholars and philosophers, their words as rich as the perfume of orange blossoms that filled the Sicilian air. Frederick's court was a place where poets recited verses in Provençal, scientists debated the nature of the heavens, and falcons soared from gloved wrists to hunt the skies. He wrote a treatise on falconry, the De Arte Venandi cum Avibus, a book that still amazes modern falconers with its detail. Imagine a king so devoted to the art of the hunt that he studied the hawk's every movement, every breath. But Frederick's love of learning didn't make him any less of a ruler, or any less feared. He clashed endlessly with the popes who called him the Antichrist for his refusal to bow to their power. His enemies claimed he kept a menagerie of wild beasts and even a harem of concubines, rumours that mixed scandal and wonder in equal measure. Some chroniclers whispered that he ordered his children to be raised in silence to see if language was natural or learned, an experiment that sounds as unsettling now as it must have then. Frederick's wars were fought with more than just swords. He was a master of diplomacy, forging alliances across Europe and the Mediterranean. He even led a crusade, though not the kind of crusade the popes wanted. In 1228 he marched to Jerusalem and negotiated its surrender without spilling a single drop of blood. The city was his, and he crowned himself king within its ancient walls. Historians still argue whether this was the act of a genius or a heretic, but either way it was an emperor's triumph. There's a curious footnote here. Frederick was fascinated by astrology, consulting the stars before every major decision. Picture him in the still hours of night peering at the sky through brass astrolabes mapping the heavens as carefully as he mapped his kingdoms. His court astrologers claim the stars whispered secrets to him whether they did or not. Frederick was always listening. Yet for all his brilliance, Frederick's reign was a constant dance with betrayal. His own sons rose against him, spurred on by the Pope's furious condemnations. He fought them as he fought the Church relentlessly, never hesitating to turn his mind's sharp edge into an executioner's blade. He was excommunicated 3 times, each excommunication a papal thunderclap that only made Frederick's defiance burn brighter. He died in 1250 in a small hunting lodge in southern Italy, his final breath slipping out beneath a canopy of stars. Some say he wore a simple hair shirt, at the end a sign of repentance for a lifetime spent dancing on the edge of blasphemy. Others say he died unrepentant, still convinced that his was a mind blessed by the divine spark of creation itself. Historians still argue, of course, because the wonder of the world was too large to be contained by any single story. Even in death, Frederick's name stirs the imagination, a legend of hawks and emperors, and the eternal clash between learning and power. You pause here, the warm air of Sicily replaced by the chill of English mists once more. Ahead waits King Stephen, a man whose reign was chaos made flesh, a kingdom torn apart by civil war, where oaths meant nothing and fear was the only constant. So pull your blanket close, friend. Let the murmur of Frederick's scholars fade as we step into a chapter of broken promises and endless night. You step away from the sunlit gardens of Frederick VI's court and find yourself in the damp, wind-swept halls of England once again. Here the air tastes of wet earth and old iron, and the walls seem to lean in close, as if they've heard too many secrets to stand straight. This is the world of King Stephen, a world of civil war betrayal, and a kingdom where no oath was worth the breath it took to swear it. Stephen of Blois became king in 1135, a nephew of Henry III, who claimed the crown in a time of uncertainty and grief. Historians still argue whether he was a usurper or simply a man who seized a kingdom when he saw it unguarded. But what's certain is that his reign was known as the Anarchy, a name that fits like a funeral shroud. Imagine England in those years, a patchwork of castles held by barons who saw the king's weakness as their opportunity. They raised their banners and their swords, swearing loyalty one day and rebellion the next. Stephen tried to hold the realm together, but it was like trying to stitch a torn cloak in the howling wind. You can almost hear the crack of burning thatch as villages burned the cries of peasants, caught between rival lords who cared nothing for their suffering. One of Stephen's greatest rivals was his cousin, Empress Matilda, daughter of Henry I and mother of the future Henry II. Matilda believed the crown was hers by right, and she would not let it go quietly. In 1141 she captured Stephen at the Battle of Lincoln. Imagine the king in chains, his face grim beneath the weight of his own ambition. Historians still argue whether Matilda truly meant to rule, or simply to break Stephen's hold on the realm. But either way, Stephen was soon free again, his supporters clawing back each lost inch of power. There's a curious tidbit here. During the Anarchy, the coinage itself became a battleground. Barons minted their own coins, each stamped with the name of a petty lord instead of the king. Imagine a kingdom where even the money had turned traitor, each silver penny a sign that the king's rule was as fragile as the frost on a winter morning. Stephen's reign was marked by endless siege and sudden treachery. Castles rose like mushrooms after the rain strongholds, where barons could hide their ambitions and their plunder. The roads became the domain of outlaws and mercenaries, and the fields lay fallow, the harvest stolen or burned before it could feed the hungry mouths of the kingdom. And yet through it all Stephen kept fighting. Historians still argue whether he was driven by duty or by the simple, stubborn pride of a man who refused to let go of the crown. He was no conqueror, no Henry II or Edward the Femme, but he was a king who would not bow even as the land beneath his feet turned to dust. In 1153, after nearly 20 years of blood and chaos, Stephen finally agreed to a compromise. His own son had died, leaving him with no heir strong enough to claim the kingdom's future. So he named Matilda's son Henry as his successor, hoping to end the endless winter of his reign. Stephen died a year later in 1154, his kingdom left in the hands of the man who would become Henry II, the first of the Plantagenet kings, and the builder of a new English order. You pause in the flickering dark, the echoes of civil war still heavy in the air. Ahead lies another kingdom of treachery and whispered conspiracies. Philip IV of France, a king whose hunger for power would bring down the mighty Knights Templar and shatter the lives of those who dared to defy him. So let the cold mist of Stephen's England slip away, friend. Let your breath become the soft sigh of the night as we step into the world of Philip, a place where kings and Templars, gold and betrayal are the only truths that matter. You leave behind the rain-soaked fields of Stephen's England and step into the marble halls of France, where the air smells of incense and the faint metallic tang of ambition. Here waits Philip IV, known as Philip the Fair, though there was little fair about the way he ruled. You can almost feel the cold marble beneath your feet, the hush of courtiers who speak in whispers, even when the king isn't in the room. Philip took the throne in 1285, a king of striking appearance, tall, handsome, with eyes that never seemed to blink. Historians still argue whether he was a man of principle or simply a monarch whose hunger for power burned brighter than any candle. Either way, his reign would leave scars on France that would linger for generations. You can almost see him now seated in judgment beneath the vaulted ceilings of the Sainte-Chapelle, his robe a deep blue scattered with golden fleur-de-lis. He ruled with a mind that was quick, and a heart that was as cold as the winter wind. He believed in the divine right of kings, but also in the cold arithmetic of power coin for coin life for life. Philip's reign was a constant struggle for control, and nowhere did that struggle burn brighter than in his war with the Knights Templar. The Templars had grown rich too rich, and Philip saw their gold as the key to his kingdom's strength. Some say he was jealous, others that he feared their secret power. Historians still argue, of course, because behind every royal command there's always the shadow of fear. On Friday, October 13th, 1307, Philip struck. The Templars were arrested in a single coordinated sweep. Hundreds of knights seized as the dawn broke over France. Imagine the clang of armoured boots on cold stone, the shock of men who had once been untouchable, now dragged in chains to the king's dungeons. Philip accused them of heresy of worshipping idols and spitting on the cross, but many believed these were just words, excuses for a king who needed their gold more than their prayers. There's a curious tidbit: the Templars were said to have confessed under torture, their screams echoing in the darkness beneath the royal fortress. Some recanted, others died in the flames, and still others cursed the king with their final breath. One of the last Grand Masters, Jacques de Molay, was burned at the stake in 1314, his voice rising above the crackling fire as he proclaimed Philip and the Pope would soon face God's justice. Some say his curse echoed across France like a funeral bell. Philip's dealings with the church were no less ruthless. He clashed with Pope Boniface VIII, demanding taxes from the clergy to fill his war chest. When the Pope refused, Philip had him seized in Anagni, an insult so shocking that it sent tremors through Christendom. Historians still argue whether it was an act of pure arrogance or a king's cold calculation in the face of papal power. But in the end, Boniface died a prisoner, and Philip's grip on France only tightened. Yet for all his power, Philip's reign was not without its price. The coin he minted, the gros tournois, was devalued again and again, each recoinage a silent admission that even kings can't cheat the scales of silver and gold forever. The peasants muttered, the merchants cursed, but Philip held his course, eyes always fixed on the prize that lay beyond each fresh scheme. He died in 1314, just months after de Molay's final curse. Some whispered it was divine retribution, others that it was merely the end of a man who had played the game of kings too long. Historians still argue, of course they do, because Philip's reign was too full of shadows to ever see clearly. You pause now, the hush of marble halls giving way to the distant sound of bells tolling in the plague-darkened streets. Ahead lies a chapter of medieval history that was written not by kings, but by the silent scythe of death itself. The Black Death waits there, a shadow that turned the world cold and made every monarch's power feel like dust in the wind. So settle in, closer friend. Let the whispers of Philip's court fade into the night as we step into the chapter of the plague, where kings and peasants alike found themselves powerless before a darkness that devoured all. You slip from the halls of Philip I's power games and find yourself in a world of quiet terror, a kingdom where the rattling cough of a peasant can sound as loud as the trumpet of an army. This is the world of the Black Death, where every breath could be a death sentence, and every king's crown was as fragile as a spider's web. It began in 1347 when a ship crept into the Sicilian port of Messina, its crew half dead, their eyes hollow, and their breath thick with pestilence. From there the plague spread like wildfire, carried by fleas and rats, but also by the heavy sigh of fate that seemed to settle over all of Europe. You can almost smell the acrid smoke of burning herbs and hear the desperate prayers whispered in cold chapels as the Black Death crept through every door. Historians still argue whether it was Yersinia pestis, bubonic plague, or some other scourge that devoured nearly half of Europe's population, but to those who lived through it, the cause hardly mattered. The signs were unmistakable boils that turned the skin-black fevers that burned like hellfire, a final rattling breath that ended life in a heartbeat. You picture the kings of the age, their robes heavy with gold but no thicker than a beggar's rags before the plague. Edward III of England, Charles IV of France, and countless lesser monarchs all found their power useless in the face of death's silent march. Even the mightiest could do nothing but watch as their people died in droves, serfs, soldiers, even the children of the court. Historians still argue whether the Black Death was God's punishment, a cosmic reckoning for centuries of sin, or simply the brute fact of nature, asserting itself in a world that had grown too crowded, too hungry. There's a curious tidbit here. Some believed that sweet-smelling posies could keep the plague at bay, tiny bouquets of herbs and flowers worn around the neck or clutched in pale, trembling hands. Ring-a-ring-a roses they would sing, though the song would only be written down centuries later. A ring of roses, a pocket full of posies, an echo of the desperate hope that scent and song could ward off the darkness. The plague didn't just kill bodies, it killed kingdoms too. Laws crumbled as magistrates died, and the labour of the fields went undone as the dead were buried in mass graves. Historians still argue whether the Black Death brought about the end of feudalism, whether the labour shortage forced lords to grant more rights to their peasants, or if it merely turned villages into lonely outposts of fear. Some kings tried to seize the moment for power. In France, Philip VI ordered prayers and processions, though the priests themselves often fell ill before the final Amen. In England, Edward III's court was filled with the smell of sweet-smelling woods and perfumes, as if they could keep the reaper from the royal threshold. And in every kingdom, charlatans and healers alike sold charms and relics, bones of saints and scraps of holy cloth, each promising a shield against the plague's black hand. Yet for all the king's efforts, death was the only sovereign in those years. You can almost hear the muffled cries of the dying, the rattling wheels of carts bearing bodies to the pits outside the city walls. The flickering candle of every monarchy seemed to tremble in that plague-darkened night, but still somehow the world turned on. The Black Death eventually receded, leaving a Europe forever changed. Fields lay empty, cities stood silent, and the echoes of the dead haunted the living for generations. And in the quiet that followed, the kings who survived found their kingdoms smaller, but their crowns perhaps a little heavier, because they had learned in those bitter years that even a king's power can be as fragile as a candle's flame in the dark. You pause in the silence, the air heavy with the memory of those lost to the pestilence. Ahead you hear the last echoes of this long midnight wander a final chapter, where the fear of the plague becomes the fear of the past itself. A last whisper in the dark, a hush before the story ends. So lean back, friend, and let the weight of those black years slip away, because in the final chapter we will walk the last corridor of these haunted halls together, one final whisper in the dark, and then rest. You step gently out of the plague-haunted fields, your breath misting in the chill of the final corridor. Here in these quiet halls, the echoes of the past grow soft like a whisper, heard only in dreams. The kings you've met tonight are gone, their shadows fading into the dark, but the hush of history still lingers, wrapping around you like a heavy cloak. This final chapter is not about any single king, but about the way their stories wrap around us all. The memories of their fearsome reigns, their ruthless choices, and the cold certainty of the grave they all shared, these are the threads that weave the tapestry of medieval history. Even in the stillness of this last room you can feel them, those ancient voices speaking in words that are half prayer and half curse. Historians still argue whether these kings were truly monsters or simply men shaped by the world around them. After all, a crown is a weight few can carry without bending beneath it. The echo of their footsteps is in every stone of these old castles, in every breath of the night air that seeps through cracked windows and crumbling walls. Their legacies are a tangle of horror and wonder, cruelty and brilliance, a reminder that history is never simple, never just black and white. You pause by a cold hearth, your candle's glow flickering in the draught that slips through the stones. There's a curious tidbit here. Some say that in the quietest hours of the night, if you listen closely enough, you can hear the soft sigh of these kings still roaming their lonely halls. Maybe it's just the wind in the chimney, or maybe it's the breath of the past itself, never quite willing to let go. As you stand there, you realise how far you've come tonight, through forests and castles, across battlefields and plague-ravaged cities. Each step has been a journey deeper into the marrow of the medieval world, where power was the only law and fear was a crown worn by every soul. You can almost feel the weight of it pressing on your shoulders, now a gentle reminder that history never truly sleeps. Ahead lies only a single door, heavy oak, and iron bound its hinges, worn smooth by centuries of silent watchers. It is the final doorway of this night's wander, the place where the echoes of ancient fears fade into the hush of the present. You rest your hand on its cool surface, feeling the pulse of the past beneath your fingertips. Beyond it waits only the quiet of your own room, the soft hum of your fan, the warm weight of your blanket. The journey ends not with the roar of battle or the clash of steel, but with a sigh, a single breath in the dark, a final gentle closing of the door on the fears of long-dead kings. So pause here, friend. Let the soft hush of history settle around you like the falling snow outside your window. Let your thoughts drift, your eyelids grow heavy, because the final chapter of this midnight wander is not written in blood or fear, but in the gentle quiet of the night. You step through the final doorway, and the air seems softer now, the chill of stone replaced by the gentle warmth of memory. You're no longer in the echoing halls of kings, no longer in the hush of ancient castles. Now you're in the last quiet corridor of this midnight journey, where the only sound is the slow beat of your own heart and the soft, steady breath of the world around you. The kings we met tonight, John, Richard, Edward, and all the rest, each carried a weight of power that could crush or crown them. Historians still argue whether they were tyrants or tragic figures, whether they ruled with the cold calculation of monsters or the desperate hope of men. But in the end, the only truth that remains is that power never comes without a price, and even the greatest kings must bow to the turning of the earth and the passing of time. You can almost hear their footsteps, still soft echoes that fade with each breath you take, like the last embers of a dying fire. The walls of their castles are nothing more than ruins, now their names etched into history's endless scroll, and yet in the hush of the night they still seem to breathe whispers in the shadows, flickers in the candlelight, reminders that the past is never truly gone. There's a curious tidbit for you. Some say that every time a historian picks up a quill or taps a keyboard, the past stirs a little like a dream that never quite ends. Every telling of these tales, every sigh, every footstep, every quiet breath keeps the memory alive. And perhaps that's all any of us can do in the end, remember, and whisper the old names back into the dark. As you settle into the soft hush of your own room, the blanket of the night tucks around you like the velvet of a royal robe. The wind outside is a gentle hum, the kind of lullaby that even the most restless ghosts might envy. You feel the weight of sleep pressing in your eyes, growing heavy as the stories we've shared tonight settle into the quiet corners of your mind. Historians still argue about how these kings lived, how they died, and whether their fears were truly so different from our own. But here in the final hush of this journey, the arguments fall away. All that remains is the soft murmur of the past, a gentle reminder that the world has always been a place of shadows and light, of kings and commoners, of dreams that flicker in the dark. So let yourself drift now, friend. Let the echoes of this midnight wander fade into the gentle rhythm of your breath. The kings are gone, the castles crumbled, but your own quiet reign is just beginning, a kingdom of soft sheets and flickering dreams of stories waiting to be told when the sun rises again. Sleep well, and may your dreams be free of tyrants and heavy crowns. Let the soft murmur of the night guide you deeper still into a slumber as deep and gentle as a forest of whispers, because the final chapter is yours to write, in the quiet hush of the world's turning and the gentle, endless peace of the night. Now let your breath slow each inhale and exhale, a soft wave that washes the last traces of this midnight journey away. Feel the warm weight of your blanket, the soft press of your pillow beneath your cheek, and let the flickering shadows of these ancient kings fade into nothing but a distant whisper. The air is cool and calm, the hum of your fan, a soothing lullaby that cradles you gently in the dark. Let the images of those candlelit halls drift further like leaves on a quiet stream. Each king's name, John, Richard, Edward, slips away, leaving only the gentle warmth of your own heart steady and calm. You are safe here, wrapped in a hush that no crown can touch, no kingdom can breach. In the soft dark of your room there are no armies, no battles, no thrones to guard. Only the slow, steady rhythm of your breath, the soft rustle of the sheets, and the sweet, simple promise of sleep. Let that promise take you now deeper and deeper, until even the softest echo of history's whispers fade to nothing but a warm sigh. The night is yours, a quiet kingdom where only peace reigns. So rest well, friend, Let the last flickers of this story become the first sparks of your dreams. May your sleep be deep, your rest unbroken, and the hush of the night a gentle shield around you.